If you are listening to this sermon from California or from just about anywhere in southern or central Cascadia, Cascadia being that massive watershed that extends down from British Columbia through Washington and Oregon, you have spent a good part of this past week under an orange and alarming sky. The word that folks are reaching for to describe this sky is apocalyptic, and that feels right. It feels like the unveiling of the end of the world, the revelation of the end of our time on this planet. The sky, with its terrifying orangeness, would be distressing enough under any circumstances, but in 2020, in the midst of pandemic, in the midst of a wildly polarized election, in the midst of the struggle against police violence and for Black dignity, in the midst of a recession with loss and hardship that we have not seen since the end of World War II, in the midst of climate change, all of this, the sky above us feels like a perverse sacrament, an outward and visible sign of all of the hurt in the world, all of the things that are going wrong. Of course, we sit beneath it, and not just because our lungs are filled with smoke, although that's sure a big part of it, but also because of everything it represents, the fearfulness that it represents. We are filled with dread, we are filled with anxiety, we are worn down. And in the midst of this, underneath this orange sky, our ministry continues. The small ministry in particular here at Grace Memorial. We continue to gather to worship God. We continue to feed the hungry. That program has actually expanded thanks to the amazing work of the people of the Free Lunch Collective, who are meeting in our parish hall to prepare food and toiletries for people living out of doors. And we continue to plan for building a new campus, for building new ministry space, new community space, and affordable housing on the campus. We were going to gather to talk today after this worship service to talk about that development, to look at the latest iteration of the plans, but we decided to cancel because of the fires. So many people are in crisis right now, or at least if you're like me, I'm not in crisis, but my emotional and spiritual reserves are really depleted. This is maybe not the time to have a meeting like this. But because we were planning on it, I spent the week thinking about these plans. And I guess my question is, under this sky, does gathering for worship matter? Does feeding the poor matter? Does planning for affordable housing and new campus matter? When so much is going wrong, what difference does any of this make? And you'll find people on TV and Twitter who are willing to ask that question in total sincerity. Sure, Portland City Council has banned the worst kind of tear gas from our streets, but if a police officer is inclined to be violent, the truncheon remains in their hand, the rubber bullets remain in their hand, they have other kinds of gas available to them. Sure, we might install solar panels on our home or on our business, but the oil barons are pumping smoke into the air so fast that the forests are going to continue to burn. It doesn't matter. Sure, we could build affordable housing on our campus, but the supply of people living in their cars or living in RVs or lying on the street or in tents is without limit. It doesn't matter. None of this matters. It's too small to make any difference. What do we think about that? What does Jesus think about that? So today, Jesus tells a folk tale. And it's a folk tale I want to suggest that is an answer to that question. What does it matter? When so much is wrong, does it make any difference to do something small? And the folk tale goes like this. Once upon a time, Once upon a time, there was a man who owed a great deal of money to someone. He was in debt up to his eyeballs and beyond. And the person to whom he owed the money was his boss. He owed his boss 100 talents. Now, scholars disagree as to how much 100 talents is in modern American dollars. I've heard estimates that range all over the place, but everyone agrees there's a whole lot of zeros involved. 100 talents might be as little as $3.5 billion, or maybe as much as $9 billion. Either way, it's a staggering amount of money, more than most of us could pay back in a lifetime, more than most of us could pay back in 10 lifetimes. It's an impossibly huge debt. And this man is called into his boss's office, and his boss says, I'd like my money back, please. And the man knows there's no way. There's no way, but he figures he's got to say something. He falls down on his face, and he says, I'm good for it. I can pay you back. Just give me a little time. And what does the boss do then? This is a folktale, so maybe you would expect the boss to do some kind of folktale Brothers Grimm violent thing. Maybe you would expect him to turn this guy into gingerbread, or take his firstborn child, or take his soul, or who knows what. But what does the boss do? The boss takes the promissory note that says, I owe you $4.5 billion, signed by our protagonist, and he tears it up. He tears it into tiny pieces, and it rains down like snowy possibility. Forget it, says the boss. Go on your way. You're forgiven. And the man can't believe it. He picks himself up from the floor, and he says, oh, thank you. Thank you. And he goes out the boss's office, and he goes out the front door of the tower where the boss lives and works. And there is this spring in his step. He is free in a way that he has not been in years, that he has not been since this debt started building up. And he says, hooray, birds in the sky, I am free. Hooray, trees on the hills, I am free. Hooray, guy I know from work, I am... Wait a minute. And he looks at the guy he knows from work, and the guy from work looks at him, and the man says, wait a minute, guy from work, you owe me money. And what the guy from work owes him is 100 denarii. Now, just like the talent, scholars are not 100% sure how much a denarii is in modern dollars, but I've heard an estimate that 100 denarii is maybe $8,700. And the guy from work doesn't have $8,700. And so the scene we just saw takes place a second time. But now the man who had been forgiven $4.5 billion is the boss. And the guy from work falls down on his face in front of him and says, please, I'm good for it. Just give me some time. And what does the man do? What does our protagonist do? He says, no, I want my money now. And if you can't pay it, you have to go to jail. And he's getting ready to dig out the handcuffs and call the paddy wagon. This is the scene, this poor man on the street weeping, the poor guy from work weeping in front of him, the man with his handcuffs, the paddy wagon coming. When out the front of the tower comes the boss. And the man looks over at him, and the boss looks at him. Their eyes lock. They look back and they see, and everybody sees what's going on. And the man, our protagonist, is like a child with his hand in the cookie jar up to the elbow. He looks at his boss and he says, it's not what it looks like. And because this is a folktale, Jesus gives it the sort of ending, the sort of slapstick violent ending that the Brothers Grimm would be proud of. The boss says to the man, I'm going to take you away. My guards are going to take you away, and you are going to be tortured. The end. It's the end of the folktale. What's the moral of the story? Well, we could answer that question in a whole lot of different ways, but here's a possible moral. Here's a moral that I am wondering about this morning. Maybe the boss is God. And maybe the man who owes money to the boss is you and me. We have these bodies that allow us to walk the earth. And we owe that to God. God gave those to us. We have these minds to think, and we owe that to God. God gave that to us. We have hearts to love, and we owe that to God. God gave that to us. We have stuff, these clothes to wear. We have some money to spend. We have chairs to sit on. I don't know what else. Look at everything in this room, this painting to look at. And God gave that to us. And we can't pay God back. We can't even begin to pay God back for all of the things God has given us. There's no possibility. And we go to God and say, please give me some time to pay back my debt. We fall on our faces before God. I can have you paid back by the weekend. And God says, forget it. Your debt is forgiven. And we go on our way free. But God has given us something else in addition to our bodies, our minds, our hearts, our stuff. And that is, God has given us the opportunity to be generous in the way that God is generous. God has given us the opportunity to imitate God's generosity. We can't imitate it on the same scale. God can forgive $4.5 billion like it's nothing. God forgives that without even blinking. But we can forgive a little. We can give away. We can be generous with a little. And the story says doing that matters. Being generous matters. It matters for us. It matters for our neighbor. It matters to God. Being generous with the gifts God has given us matters not because God will torture us if we don't know. God does not torture us. God was never in the torture business. That is a folktale ending, not a fact about God. But because clutching onto our gifts, frantically holding them on, it's no good for the world and it's no good for our souls. There is a kind of torture in clutching this tightly, but the torture is something we do to ourselves. What if we let go? What if we were generous? Generous in the imitation of God. So Jesus gives the folktale an unhappy ending, a brutal ending, a Brothers Grimm ending. And in so doing, I want to suggest that he is inviting us to rewrite the tale. He's inviting us to write our own happy ending to the story. How might it go? So the man falls on his face in front of the boss and says, give me some time to pay you back. And the boss says, forget it. Your debts are forgiven. And he tears up the promissory note and it rains down like snowy possibility. And the man gets up and he says, thank you. And he leaves the boss's office free like he's never been before. There is this new spring in his step. Out he goes, the front of the office, and he says, I am free to the birds in the sky. He says, I am free to the trees on the hills. He says, I am free to guy at work who owes me money. And they stop, the guy at work and the man, they look at each other and they think, and the guy from work is about to fall on his face and say, please give me time, I can pay you back. But before that even happens, the man says, forget it. Forget it. It's forgiven. You are forgiven. And he tears up the promissory note and it rains down like snowy possibility. And the guy from work goes on his way, suddenly free. And maybe he forgives someone else, and maybe they forgive someone else, and maybe they forgive someone else, and this virtuous cycle begins, this holy cycle begins. But we don't know, because the camera stays on the man, stays on the protagonist who has just forgiven this debt, who has just given away some of the gifts that he's received, who has just imitated God. You'd think he would sting. You'd think it would hurt to give this away. And somehow it doesn't. $8,700 is not $4.5 billion, but it's not nothing either. But the man lets it go, and he's actually a little more free. The story This folktale that Jesus tells today is a folktale that he embodies in the rest of his life. In the rest of his life, he answers the question, do small things matter when so much is wrong? Jesus lives under occupation. He lives under the brutality, the violence of the Roman regime. And under that kind of violence, someone might ask the question, does healing people matter when there is so much new violence happening all the time? But Jesus heals people anyway. He lives in a time when there is so much hunger. So many people are wondering where their next meal is from. And someone might very well say, what does it matter to feed a few people? But Jesus feeds them anyway. Jesus lives in a time just like now, in which there is no shortage of religious authorities willing to tell you that God is small and petty and violent and vindictive and doesn't like you all that much. In the face of those stories, what is the point of telling a story of freedom, a story in which God is loving and joyous and wants us to be fully alive? What's the point? Does it even matter? But Jesus tells those stories anyway. Jesus proclaims across his life that even when things look desperate, even when the sky has turned orange, even when the cross is near, even when it seems like nothing matters very much, when we cannot put a dent in the hurt, that the small things matter, that imitating God still matters. Think of this man. Think of this man in the story that Jesus invites us to write, the ending that Jesus invites us to write. He has been forgiven, he has received this holy generosity, and he has turned around and given it to another. He's let go. He's stopped clenching. He's out $8,700. And maybe that feels like a loss, but somehow, amazingly, to this man, unclenching doesn't feel like a loss at all. He goes on his way light and free. He goes on his way whistling with joy to creation, to himself, to God. He is full of joy and possibility and wonder. This small action set his neighbor free, and somehow it set him free as well.